My name is Leah Greer. I'm a reference archivist here at the archive. This presentation is geared towards tracing family history, so doing genealogy work. It also is applicable to if you are a historian and you're interested in researching Black Delawareans. It will highlight some of the archive's records that we have that might be useful to you. So, from a family history perspective, the first point when embarking on your family history is yourself. You always want to start with writing down everything that you know, what you think you know about your family, including names, dates, relationships, places, occupations. All of these things can help to inform the research that you do. And whatever stage you are in your research, review what you have. So it's always good to go back through the notes that you have. Sometimes clues are hidden within those records that you haven't made sense of yet. And going back over them, suddenly you might uncover a name and you go, oh, that's how those people are connected. So it's always great to review and look at things with fresh eyes. Your first and greatest resource, aside from what you know, of course, is gathering oral history. Any recollections that you have from living relatives, the stories that they've collected. Usually every family has even that one person who seems to know everything about everybody. So tap those resources. Those resources are incredibly useful, and oftentimes you'll find that a relative has already done quite a bit of research that you didn't even know about. So a cousin, an aunt, something like that might have done a bit of research. Utilize that, collectively work together. Genealogy and more broadly family history tells your family's role, your personal connection to history. And particularly in this time, in this day and age, it's really important that we own our history, that we acknowledge our history, and that we preserve our history. And you are the first point to do that. Okay, so let's jump right in. Before we go any further, a little content note. As historians, family historians, archivists, memory keepers, in the course of our research, we often uncover offensive, disturbing, and even harmful content. So please be aware that the material in our collection may contain content that is harmful or offensive. Okay? The items found in our archives and their descriptions represent the time that they were created. Whenever possible, so these items often retain their original descriptions to preserve historical accuracy and to provide social and historical context. Okay? The Delaware Public Archives is dedicated to reviewing and enhancing our descriptive practices to incorporate more respectful and inclusive terminology whenever possible. So you will see both of those things occurring when we go through the records currently. Okay. Okay, the first, probably the lifeblood of any genealogical research are vital records. Vital records are records of births, marriages, and deaths. Those are collected by the state. In 1913, the state of Delaware required that all births, deaths, and marriages be registered by the Office of Vital Statistics. We have public records of births after 72 years. We have marriages after 50 years and deaths after 40 years. So if you're accessing those are public records. Those are available to you once they are at that date. In some cases, birth certificates were created for people born before 1913 as a delayed record. So sometimes we also have certificates for people previous to 1913. And this is an example here of one of those types of records. So I'm just going to, you see here, this is a birth certificate for a Lola Bowers. She was born in 1902, but her birth certificate was created because obviously she needed it at some point in her life. Her birth certificate was created from the birth record of her child, who was born in 1936, which listed her as being 34 years. So using that as context and information. So one of the reasons why we'll look to things like birth certificates, well, this is a gold mine. So not only do we know Lola, but we know the birth record of her child. So we have 2 generations here. We also have record of her parents, and then we also have record of her census record in 1920, which shows that she was the daughter of John and Tabitha Bowers. Okay, so that type of information is all included in one certificate. On the right-hand side, this is the death certificate of said Tabitha Bowers. So her mother is then recorded here. So we can look at that. She died in 1961 at age 81. Okay. So here, again, we have even more generational information. We have her father's name and her mother's name. Okay, so now we've from one record gone back another generation. So we have 3 generations included in these records. Okay, so pre-1913. We do also have records pre-1913. Those are compiled from different sources. They're not state-generated records. They can be local registers. They can be Bible records, court records. Naturally, there are some omissions. So it won't be a complete record of everyone, but we do have some records from these time periods, such as here's a return of marriage for John Bowers, age 30 to Tabitha Gibbs. So remember Tabitha Bowers, who we just looked at? This is her marriage record. She was 21, he was 30. They got married in 1900. So here you see the date of marriage. What's fascinating about this is that you also then, of course, have where they lived. They lived at Bowers Beach. You have his occupation. So you have a lot of information. You also have the bride's parents, George and Sarah Gibbs. Okay. We also then, of course, have on the right-hand side an example of a local record that was created. And this is actually from Tabitha's grandfather, Nathan Gibbs. And here we have his information. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of detail. Some of it's a little bit vague, such as the cause of death simply says old age. But this certificate is dated 1892. And he was 80 years old at that time. So if we extrapolate from that, he was born in around 1812. So again, moving back generationally, we have a lot of information. So staying with the Gibbs family, we come across another type of record that can establish family bonds. These are referred to as bastardy bonds. This predates what we now know as paternity suits, right? And the idea being this was created by the trustees of the poor such that a child born out of wedlock would not be a ward of the state, would not be responsible for the ward of the state to take care of them. So the alleged father is named here, Nathan Gibbs, is named as the alleged father, and a surety, Abel Gibbs, is the one saying, yes, indeed, this is the father of this child. These types of records note the mother of the child and the sex of the child. Unfortunately, they don't give us the name of the child, but we do have that the mother was Ann Gibbs. And in this case, we also have a notation of race. So you see after each name, there's a little N. In this case, probably because of the time period, that would indicate Negro, yes.
Now, for that time frame, about 18, let's say.
This is 1830.
No, but I'm just going to do an example for about 1902. If you come across a birth certificate and it says the person is legitimate, then normally there was some type of marriage involved.
Correct.
That was proven.
Correct. Yeah. I will say that oftentimes you didn't have to supply that marriage record. So it's taking the word of the two parties that they were married.
Well, I came here and I actually had that document and it did say legitimate, but I'm like.
Right, but what I'm saying, when they filled out the birth certificate, they weren't required to prove that they were married. So it's based on their word that they were.
But that's what I'm saying, so because it says legitimate,
Mhm.
and
You can assume that they were married, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So, following again, the Gibbs family, okay? Family bonds may not be entirely clear in this case, but here we have an example of where we can infer that there might have been some family bond. This is an apprentice indenture. And apprentice indentures were, and this is dated from 1834 in Camden, so right up the road from here, right? We have an indication of a George Gibbs. He's identified as mulatto, and he's aged 14 and 1 month. Now, the reason why we have a very precise age for George is because an apprentice indenture is a bond by which a minor would be bond to the service and the apprenticeship of another person for a set amount of time, usually until they reached adulthood. And in this case, he was apprenticed to Abel Gibbs. So Abel Gibbs, as we remember in the bastardy bond, he was the suretor. He was the person assuring us that George, and here there's a young George who is apprenticed to him. He's actually apprenticed to learn bricklaying, and he's apprenticed until he reaches the age of 21, in which case he will also not only learn the skill of bricklaying, but also receive 6 months of schooling. Now, Abel is also listed by race, again, with the letter N next to his name. So in this case, we have a young mulatto boy being apprenticed to a Black Delawarean who was a bricklayer, so a professional man. In fact, we do know that Abel Gibbs had a large business going at the time. And note the date too, 1834. So he was a free Black man during the time of slavery. Okay. So again, let's look at Abel Gibbs. Abel Gibbs, 1850. So again, slavery was legal. Okay, he's a free Black man in Camden, listed as the head of household. In his household are listed, so there's Abel Gibbs listed as the head of household. Now, 1850 censuses, all we have are tick marks. We don't have an enumeration of everybody who lives there. We don't have their names. We don't have their ages. We have ranges. And we know the sex, and we know the race, and we know a relative age range. So from here, we see that there are 2 Black men or boys between the ages of 10 and 24 living in his household in 1850. Perhaps one of them is Nathan Gibbs from the bastardy bond, the father of the child. Perhaps, it's possible, because obviously Abel was close enough to him to be able to assure us that he indeed was the father of this child, so he could have been a close relative. We also can assume that maybe one of them is young George, who is being apprenticed. Okay, so these types of clues, putting documents together, we can take a vague census like this, and we might be able to identify who those individuals are living in the household. Yeah.
The location, did it say Camden or did it say North Murder Kill?
Murder Kill, yeah, it's not specific to Camden, but we do know that he was in the Camden area.
So it probably said North Murder Kill.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going to give us a precise location, it's just going to give us the 100. But yeah, from that. Okay, so moving on from our fascinating story of the Gibbs, but that was an example of how we can use those different types of records to create a large picture of this family and this family's movement through time. So military records are a wonderful resource, and a wonderful resource for getting a lot of detail about an ancestor's life and personal story. We know that Black Delawareans served in every war in the history of this state and before this was a state. This is an illustration that was created artistically of a Civil War soldier serving in Delaware City. There is the Union Cemetery, African Union Cemetery in Delaware City, which I encourage you to visit if you can get a chance. It's the African Union Church Cemetery in Delaware City. They do have a little museum there, or a placard that describes the soldiers that were found in the cemetery who had served in the Civil War. So let's go on to some of the just having. Okay. Okay, so let's start with the Revolutionary War. In the early phase of the war, we know that we had Black Delawareans serving and fighting alongside other patriots in militia groups. When these militia groups coalesced into the Continental Army, Black soldiers were blocked initially from joining the Continental Army. Slaveholders, particularly in the southern states, had fear of arming enslaved people for fear of uprising. So the British, cleverly, then offered freedom to any enslaved person who fought for their cause. So you will often hear a red coat meant freedom. So you did have a lot of Black Delawareans joining the ranks of British soldiers to gain their own emancipation. A lot of those soldiers ended up emigrating to Canada following the war. That's a fascinating other story that we can't get into today, but very fascinating. However, the Continental Army eventually changed course. They realized that they were essentially causing themselves defeat. So 1777, Continental regiments officially enrolled Black soldiers into their ranks. Our Revolutionary War records don't actually enumerate race of soldiers. So we do have to do a little bit of detectiving to identify who the Black Delawareans were who were serving in the ranks. Oftentimes it's done by identifying names and our knowledge of family names. In this case, we know of a man named Cato Fagan, who served on the American side of the Revolution. He enlisted actually in 1776 in a flying camp. And in June of 1777, he enlisted in Captain John Learmonth's company of the Delaware Regiment. So the Delaware Regiment that we see pictured in here, he would have been in that. We don't actually know much more beyond that initial enlistment. We don't have any records, but we think he may have deserted ranks, we're not sure. This is the original record. So what I showed you here, this is a transcription. This is available on our website of Revolutionary War records. We do also have the original muster rolls. So to see those, and Cato Fagan is online. Where is he? Anyway, he's up there. Okay, so another Revolutionary War record that is very useful. Because the muster rolls often did not enumerate race, we have pension records. So following the Revolutionary War, soldiers would apply for pensions. And here we see an example of that. This is the pension application of a man by the name of Edward Harmon. This application is dated from 1820, okay? Here we see he's listed as 70 years of age when he's making this pension application in 1820. So this, again, we can use to extrapolate the year of his birth. We also have a wonderful description in the application of not only where he lives in Sussex County in the Lewis-Rehoboth Hundred. We also have an enumeration of his children and his wife Agnes, who is 50 years old, his son Benjamin, his son Dirksen, his son Painter, his son Woolsey, and a daughter Eliza. Okay, so here we have a complete picture of the entire family in a pension record. So if you were doing family research, this is an incredible resource for that. Also, very interestingly, to create a picture of the type of life that he would have been living in 1820, the pension record included an inventory of all of his possessions, including 3 shotes. Anybody know what a shote is? It's a pig, it's a young pig. So he had 3 young pigs, furniture like a cupboard, a table, a spinning wheel, a plow, and a basket. So it gives you a real good picture of what his life was like in 1820, yeah.
And you were saying pension records, they do indicate race?
They do.
Okay.
Well, I mean, in this case, I don't believe it does, but it gives us a really clear example of where he lives and it gives us a way to trace his census record. And that does give us his race. Interestingly enough, in this case, he's listed as, and this is the wording of the time, a free colored male. Now, there is some speculation with the name Harmon here in Delaware that he may have been Native American. So that is a possibility. When we see something like this, there's no distinction made. However, we can look at this record, and he's listed as the head of household. Remember, this time we only have tick marks for the other people in the household, but we match it to the pension record and we see an example of, we know that he is listed here as, we know that his age, that would have been him. We see his sons, his two older sons were already out of the household, but we see his son Painter, we see his son Woolsey, we see his wife Agnes, and his daughter Eliza. Okay, so we can match the names that we see from the pension to the census record, and we can compile a complete story from that. Okay, in the Civil War, in October of 1863, Abraham Lincoln ordered that so-called colored troops could be recruited into the Union Army. So by December of that year, Delaware set up recruiting stations. And according to the order, all persons enlisted into military service shall forever thereafter be free. That was the wording of the order issued by Lincoln. But nonetheless, that was what he ordered. Free persons and slaves within written consent of their owners would be aid and comfort of the rebellion may be enlisted. Okay, so this is the enlistment of colored troops order that was issued. And here we see an example of one of those recruiting efforts. This is 1865. This is a list of recruits within Delaware. On line 2, we see, for example, a man by the name of John Beecham from East Dover. Okay? And we can actually find some of his records, his service records. He's described as 21 years of age, 5 foot 5 inches tall. It tells that he was born in Dover, and his occupation was a hostler. Anybody know what a hostler is? Not a hustler, a hostler. A hostler was a groom or a stableman who took care of horses, often at an inn. So in times of horse and carriage, people would pull up with their horse and carriage, and he would take care of the horses. It's always fascinating when you find an occupation that doesn't exist today. You're like, what do you do? So he did serve in the Civil War. It's unclear what happened after 1865. It is possible that he deserted, but we're not sure. Okay, so let's move ahead. We've got a lot to go through. So World War I, servicemen records. Now, by this point, servicemen records are extremely detailed. We have indication of the date and place of birth, their parents' names, addresses, all the engagements and battles that they were in, any decorations that they received, if they died in service, the cause of their death. So in this case, we see the record for Ernest LaFrance Jones, born September 14th, 1899 in Wilmington. We know his address at the time that he was enlisted. We know his father's name and his father's address. So again, we have a generational connection. We know that the first battle that he was engaged in occurred right around his 19th birthday in France. And he served in France as a clerk for the intelligence section of the 1st Battalion of the 365th Infantry. We also know that in 1918, he was gassed. Remember, this is World War I. He did survive, though. So let's move ahead to World War II. We have an extensive World War II collection, which includes many photographs, and this is a beautiful example of that. Richard and John Neal, brothers. And here is the 1940 census record that tells us more about Richard and John. Richard here, age 19, John, age 14, for from the 1940 census, which makes me think that John might have lied about his age when he enlisted. We also know their parents, Richard and Della, here. So this is the complete record, Richard and Della with his parents, as well as their 8 siblings. So there were 10 in total. They lived near Cooch's Bridge, Christiana Highway in the Pencader 100 in Newcastle County. Their father is also listed as his occupation being in print manufacture. So we can follow these from the census record. We also then can follow their birth certificates. So we have Richard Arthur Neal, born 1920, John Wesley Neal, born 1925. We have their parents listed. Now, John's birth certificate, you know, we talked about birth certificates being created for people born before 1913. Well, John wasn't born before 1913, but it is a delayed certificate, okay? And it was created in 1937. And it was, interestingly enough, witnessed by his grandmother, Emma Neal. So here, again, these records provide us this great information. Now we have an additional generation in that. So we don't know why it was created delayed. My suspicion is there were 10 kids. Maybe they were like, oh yeah, we did John. And then we're like, oops, we didn't. So we had to do it later. So here we are. But fabulous information. Tracing the Neal family even further, Richard and John Neal's father, we have his delayed birth certificate here, and provides names of his parents, Richard Arthur Neal and Emma Wright. Remember Emma, who told us about his birth, her grandson's birth? Well, there she is. It also tells us about a sister, Mary Edna Mercer, which is right here. So again, she was listed on there. So fantastic. Again, you might find unexpected information when you're looking at this. The 1900 census identifies the address of Richard and John's father, so Richard Arthur Neal, as well as his siblings and their birth years and family members. So tracing back through. Going one step further, we have Richard Neal, the grandfather of John and Richard. And this is his death certificate. Okay, the Korean War. We have this incredible record that was given to us of Captain James Franklin Fitzgerald, who was a doctor who served in a MASH unit in the Korean War. He was highly decorated. He actually received 3 Purple Hearts, as well as the Bronze Star for his service. Really incredible record. I would definitely encourage looking into him. And of course, we do also have his birth certificate. During the Vietnam War, a journalist by the name of Nancy Lynch, she was a columnist for the Wilmington Morning News. She created something called Vietnam mailbags, where she encouraged any Vietnam soldiers to write in to her and provide a photograph and a little description. This one is a beautiful example of Sergeant James Mayfield, who very sweetly signed always a first stater, although he actually was born in Virginia. But, he came to Delaware in 1950 and joined the Army in 1952. He actually served both in Korea and Vietnam. So this is a fascinating story. But these types of personal details are really what these types of records really give you. Wartime also provided us a lot of pictures of individuals. Here on the left-hand side, we see a Red Cross mess hall, and oftentimes, as soldiers were in uniform, the whole family would get together and do a formal portrait. So here we see an example. This is from the Curtis Duncan family, but a beautiful example. And this is actually what was on the flyers. You saw a colorized version, but you know, everyone's in their best and looking extremely dapper. Okay. So another type of record that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think about are industry records. Okay, certain industries became draws for Black workers moving north during what's known as the Great Migration. So moving from southern states to northern states. Here in Delaware, examples of that are the steel mills up north, in this case in Claymont. And oftentimes communities would grow up and around these industry sites. Sometimes housing was also provided by the industry itself. So in this case, the Worth Steel Mill actually provided housing for their workers. And they were built in 1919, but they created the housing as segregated housing. Okay, so you had housing for the black workforce and housing for the white workforce. The black workforce was a collection of 24 row houses divided between 2 blocks, and it was known as Hickman's Row. So from 1919 to 1962, this housed the workforce for the steel mill and became a vibrant community based in and around these 2 blocks. The blocks were sold in 1962 from the company and went to individual buyers, so the sort of the integrity of the community kind of dissolved a little bit. But in 2005, Hickman's Row put an application to become a historic district. And so the pictures that we see here, these are pictures that were taken in 2005 when they were registered with the National Register of Historic Places. This gives you an idea of what the type of work that they would have done at the steel mill. This is some smelting work. As you can imagine, it was very taxing, very dangerous type of work people did. But we do have these photographs of the actual work as well. And we also have newspaper articles in 1996. There was a reunion for former residents of Hickman's Row to celebrate the community's legacy. There's a lot of wonderful stories that are told in here of people's memories of the gardens, the farming that people brought with them to essentially what was like an urban environment, but they brought with them these skills and created this wonderful, vibrant community is existing in Claymont. Okay. We can also then look to the evolution of that community by looking at census records. And here we see a 1930 census record. Here we can see an example. We see all of the people listed as working in the steel mill. So we know that this is indeed a record of those individuals who were living there at Hickman's Row. And here we see their place of origin. So here's a perfect snapshot of the Great Migration. You see that people were from Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. So we see that all of these people had moved and migrated from south to north to work in Delaware. Okay, another example of a Black community are free Black communities that existed during the time of slavery, okay? There are well-documented and well-established free Black communities throughout the state. Some can be traced back to the various earliest dates of the state. They coexisted along enslaved individuals, so there's an interesting dynamic that occurred here. This is, so communities such as Polktown, St. John's Neck, Lewis, Belltown, Laurel are just some examples. This is an 1868 map of an area west of Lewis known as Belltown. Okay, that's this area here. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. At the center of the free Black community was the Nassau School number 198. This building exists today and is actually being restored by the Department of Historical and Cultural Affairs. It's an example of the 80 plus schools, and the books that you should have picked up at the beginning, we'll talk about these, that were funded by the DuPonts in 1920 to improve the educational conditions of Black students. Now, of course, during this time period, schools were segregated. So retaining the segregated school systems, these schools were built all throughout the state, and they were often built by the same template. So if you see a building that looks like this, those were those DuPont schools. So Belltown was a cluster of houses and churches and the school, okay? And it's at an intersection of roads known in the 19th century as Prettymanville. It's now 5 Points. It was attributed to have been founded by a free Black man who was a landowner by the name of Jacob Bell. We don't actually have any deed records of that, but I'll get to that in a second. The schoolhouse, although it was rebuilt in the 1920s, had existed there for at least 60 years prior. Okay, so this is an example of what the schoolhouse looked like prior to that. And this is actually a report that was issued by the Freedmen's Bureau, issued to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1868. Okay, so this is signed by a teacher by the name of Pauline Allen, and she is reporting to the Freedmen's Bureau about who is at the school and the number of students that are there. So the Freedmen's Bureau records are extremely useful for getting a picture of the community. Oftentimes schools were that center of a community, and you have a really excellent picture. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress in 1865. Their intention was to create and fund schools within border and former Confederate states after the Civil War. Okay, so from that too, we also have educational directories. In this case, we see the school that I listed, and we see particularly the trustees of the school, who are often listed here, as well as the teachers. So this again is a great way to get a little snapshot as to what families were living in that community. These people would have been from the community and would have been prominent figures in that community. And we'll see these names pop up when we look at more about Belltown. So Norwood, Mall, so these are the two churches that existed in Belltown. Both buildings still exist. This one no longer has a congregation, it's actually for sale. But this one is still a vibrant and existent congregation and has a beautiful cemetery, which I definitely encourage anyone to visit. So small community, supported two churches. Okay, we can look again to census records, and in this case, we're tracing backwards through census records. We're looking for some of the same names. Remember Ralph Norwood, who was one of the trustees for the school. There he is, and there he is, and there he is. So we're seeing the community as it goes back decade by decade. We often see some of the same names appearing again and again and again. So again, Mall, right there, okay? So we have Mall, Williams, Painter, Burton, White, all of these names exist in this community and over generations. We see their children buying houses, we see the grandmothers, etc. Okay. So getting back to Jacob Bell, he was a supposed founder of Belltown. He was born in about 1790. Okay, he's first recorded in the 1820 census. Okay, and that's this census here, pictured here. He also lived near two free black men, Cato and Peter Lewis, but also near several white households that contained both free blacks and enslaved people. So you imagine this community, we have free blacks, we have white households with free blacks, we have white households with enslaved people as well. Okay. In this census, we can extrapolate that he was married to his wife Nancy, and that they had 3 sons as well. So here you see an example. There's Peter Lewis. You see the N next to his name. You see Cato Lewis, N next to his name, and Jacob Bell, N next to his name. So we get a little picture of this community as it's in its earliest times. Here's Jacob Bell from the 1830 census. Here he's existing in a household again with his wife and children. Again, the community represents both white and free black households. The surnames of the surrounding property owners suggest the same surnames that we would see later in Belltown already starting. And then here's the 1840 census. We again established Jacob Bell owned a house and a lot in Belltown, and the community was clearly by this point taking shape with at least 10 of the 16 households around him listed as free black. Okay, so we see how this community is starting to grow up and establish itself in and around. But mind you, this is 1840, so well before, again, emancipation. Some of the same names we see that we saw in the much later dates. We see Mall, we see White, and these same families were there from the beginning. As I said, we can't find any of the deeds, so that the story, unfortunately at this point, is just lore. We don't know that Jacob Bell actually sold any property to other members of his community, but he certainly retained his name. Okay, so let's get into some of the records for enslavement. Confronting slavery in your own family tree can be a very challenging process. Okay, at this point of history, members of the families would not have been recorded as individuals. They were recorded as property. So tracing the lives of enslaved people means doing supplementary research on the people who enslaved them. And this is a challenging and obviously sometimes conflicting type of research to undertake, okay? Some people choose to create a separate family tree. So you have sort of enslaved ancestors and enslavers, two family trees that you'll match together. The slaveholders' records that you'll be looking at will be things like tax assessments, and then you might have from the enslaved ancestors themselves petitions for freedom. You'll have manumission documents, you'll have court records, deeds, as well as wills. So let's get into some of these types of records that we have. Within the archives collection, we have what is referred to as the only known portrait of an enslaved individual, meaning that this is a portrait, a seated portrait, and we know that at the time she was enslaved. The only identifier we have for her, unfortunately, is the nickname Jints, Jints. We know here that the child that she's holding is a girl by the name of Hannah Stockley, and that this portrait is from 1860. Hannah's grandfather was a man by the name of James Anderson. He lived in Georgetown 100, and he is said to be the enslaver of this woman here. So let's look at James Anderson. Yeah.
When you have a situation like that,
I'm gonna go back to here. Yeah.
And you have to go by the enslaver.
Yeah.
How common is it when you, as you're going through the enslavement, to come up with pictures? Or would this be?
It's uncommon. I mean, as I say, this is the only known picture that we have within our record of a portrait that's named. So that's not common, unfortunately. Of course, 1860, it's not common to find pictures of anyone, to tell the truth. Formal portraits were rare. So the fact that we have this is remarkable. But yeah, unfortunately, pictures from that time period are very sparse. So we're tracing using the enslaver's name, we're using James Anderson to try to find out some detail about who this woman might have been. This is a tax assessment. Okay, so a tax assessment obviously lists property. In this case, it lists 11 enslaved people in the household of James Anderson, including a man by the name of Solomon, who was age 60, a man by the name of James, 45, Isaac, 25, Edgar, 18, Lewis, 18, Gideon, age 8, Casper, age 18, a woman by the name of Dinah, age 55, and a woman by the name of Ginny, age 40, as well as two young girls, Mary, 14, and Caroline, 14. So my supposition, and I of course have no proof for this, but Ginny to me sounds very similar to Jints, and she's about the right age given that picture. So I'm going to assume that's very possible that might be who that picture is about. Okay, so the census records for 1850 and 1860 included slave schedules. Okay, slave schedules were listed under the name of the slaveholder and listed the number of enslaved people owned, as well as their gender and their age, but it did not include their names. But this can be a good cross-reference point. So if you have something like a tax record and you have a list, as I said, we have like Solomon, we have Isaac, we have Edgar, we know their names and their ages, and then if we match that to a census record, then we can match that that's the right age for that individual within the slave schedule. So we're using these two to kind of reinforce each other.
Now, as far as you know, the slave records, they pretty much are just geared between 1850 and 18.
The slave schedules only exist in those two censuses. Yeah. Prior to that, you did have tick marks of enslaved individuals, but it wasn't a separate type of slave schedule. It was just incorporated in the census record. Okay, so this is a court petition because during slavery, we had a law within the state of Delaware that for slaveholders to bring people across state lines, they had to procure a license to do so. So this is an example of that. In 1848, we have an example of a man by the name of J.W.F. Jackson of Murder Kill 100. He petitioned the court to bring into the state from Maryland 2 young boys, Alfred, age 13, and John, age 5. So again, matching census records for someone named Jackson in Murder Kill 100, if we see 2 young men of that age, then we can identify, we would now have at least first names for those individuals. So this is a supplementary record that we can use to try to identify individuals. Again, you'll see those same types of petitions in enrolled bills. So this one was to the Kent County Court. This one was to the General Assembly. Same sort of idea of it was petitioning to bring people across state lines. This particular petition was from 1793, a woman by the name of Anna Adams and a man by the name of John Browns asked permission from the General Assembly to bring 2 enslaved people from Maryland. So this also gives us a clue if we, for example, are tracing Anna Adams or John Brown as the enslavers of an individual, we know at this point that we now have to go to Maryland for more records. That we now have, we know that these people were brought, the people that they are petitioning to bring into the state were brought from a separate state. Okay. Anna, so we have more detail about this. We know that Anna was petitioning to bring in a woman by the name of Monica from Anne Arundel County, Maryland. So we know specifically, if we are looking for Monica, we're then going to have to go to Anne Arundel. We're going to have to go to Maryland Archive for more information about her. John was petitioning to bring in a man by the name of Job from Kent County, Maryland. Okay, so again, we have a county, we have a location for where he might have come from. Within our small manuscript collections, so small manuscript collections are not records created by the state, they were actually created by an individual, and they are listed in an individual's collection. So this is actually within the Ridgely collection. You notice that this room is named after Ridgely. So we do have a lot of papers, but this is actually a bill of sale for a woman named Leah from Levi Stafford to James Adams in 1796. So again, tracing the enslaver, in this case, if, for example, we had found record of her under records of James Adams, we know that previously she had been listed under records of Levi Stafford. Okay, so that's what these types of records can illustrate for us. We also give, we are given a place and time for where she lived and where she was residing. Another very interesting type of record, a man by the name of Joseph Barker, who was a sort of general store merchant, located on Barker's Landing in Murder Kill 100. He kept a ledger of his sales that he made, and he kept it, strangely enough, referred to as the Negro ledger. Within that, we have individual names of his customers and the things that they've purchased within that. So again, it's just a little snapshot, but it gives you a full name of an individual who lived in that area at that time. And again, a little bit of context of some of the things that they might have been buying, like linen, like sugar, like tobacco. Okay, so those are really interesting. Oftentimes, the payments were made with trade or labor. So these individuals, after their name, it says Negro. In some cases, they would have been free. In some cases, they would have been purchasing on behalf of. Okay. We also have church records from the same time period, and church records list individual names and ages, which is fascinating and incredible. This is actually from the Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church in Wilmington, and is referred to as the Sunday class of colored members. Okay, so we have a clear idea of the race of everyone listed here, but we have their full name and age. Okay, so newspapers published advertisements offering rewards for the recapture of freedom-seeking enslaved people, so-called runaways. Okay, this is a fragment from a newspaper from 1799, and it shows advertisements for 4 individuals with rewards ranging from $10 to $40. The men are named and descriptions are given, giving their height, appearance, distinguishing features like scars, and any clothing they happen to be wearing at the time. So we can see this first example here is for Ben, aged 22 years, with a scar on his forehead, wearing a so-called sailor jacket, and a $40 reward was offered for him. Christopher is described as having a scar on his upper side of his right wrist. He is said to have been a quote-unquote free-spoken fellow. He wore a high-crowned felt hat, and then only a $10 reward was offered for his capture. This last name here, unfortunately, was cut off. We only see this little bit that his name started with an L and an E. He's said to have been 5'7" tall, with a high prominent forehead, carrying several pairs of clothes because it was believed that he was headed to Philadelphia to rejoin manumitted relatives. So we have a really interesting story of this particular individual attempting to go to Pennsylvania and to join free relatives there. Another example of a newspaper advertisement. This is a recapture, and in this case we have a full name of a man by the name of David Peterson, age 23. We're given a description of his clothing, his physical description, personal traits. We also have his enslaver's name, Jacob Baker. So if we wanted to trace more back about David Peterson, records under the name of Jacob Baker would be a clue to that. Okay, so also within this we have manumission records. Now, manumissions are petitions for the emancipation or release from slavery. Okay, these are granted by the enslaver. These typically appear in deed books. They can also be found in will books, and they also can be found in these manuscript collections, so these collections of individuals. In this case, that's one of these examples. This is included also within the Ridgely collection. Okay. In this case, John Allen Houston manumitted the following individuals: Lucius, age 51, Elizabeth, age 29, George, age 25, 2 months and 16 days. Now, why such a specific age? Because he would not have been freed until he reached the age of 25. Okay? So within this document, this is the official document for George's freedom, but it does not take effect until he reaches the age of 25. Same thing for Joseph, age 21, 2 months, 15 days, also not until he's 25. We have Grace, age 12 years, 6 months, 20 days. She would be free at 20. Leah, age 9, 6 months, also free at 20. Anne, age 7 and 8 months, free at 20. Luce, age 6 and 9 months, free at 20. Tobias, age 4 and 4 months, free at 25. So you see a pattern here. So the men are freed at 25, the women are freed at 20. Why is that? In 1810, there was a law in Delaware that the children of manumitted enslaved people would be freed once they reached adulthood. At the time, the sentiment was along the lines of providing for these children. The sentiment was kind of paternalistic, and this notion that if they were freed and under the care of their parents, their welfare could not have been ensured. However, we can also look at it as the enslaver essentially received a continued period of free labor for that period. okay? During enslavement, we have birth records. So the condition of the mother during her pregnancy determined the condition of the children by law. So if a mother was enslaved, she was pregnant, her child would therefore be considered enslaved as well. This one gives the full name of the mother, Elizabeth Ringgold Newnham, and her 3 children, Emmeline, Reese, Sarah Ann. The name of the slaveholder was William Denny. He testifies to having purchased Elizabeth's service for a term of years from a Jacob R. Griffin. Okay, so again, have to do some detectiving here, but this was fairly common practice, particularly in Delaware, where people did not have large plantations, where they had small, often a few people working at any given time. So if they had need of additional people, they might have purchased and hired the service of an enslaved person from another enslaver for a period of time. And so that record, if we're tracing Elizabeth, we know that for a time she was within the household of William Denny, but previous to that she was in the household of Jacob Griffith. Okay, so again, we need to do a little detectiving there. The second record, unfortunately, we don't have as much detail. The mother's name is Anne, a child Grace. We have a slaveholder's name as David Taylor. I just wanted to put this up. This is that particular law here, okay, so that you know. Children born to an enslaved person. And here it lists that age, 25 years for males and 21 years for females. So remember, for that manumission, the 25 for males, 21 for females in terms of when they were free. Did you get it? Oh, absolutely. So that's a really important point and often explains some of those reasons why, particularly if you see somebody who is manumitted, but not until a certain date. Which then gives us clues to things like this, petitions for freedom. This is a particular petition for the Court of Common Pleas. An enslaved person by the name of Isabella is seeking freedom for herself and for her 2 young children. So, she says that she is entitled to freedom by the laws of the land. She doesn't specify which law it is, but it's very likely that in this case she's referring to the fact that perhaps she was the child of a manumitted enslaved person, that she should have received freedom at age 21, and that her 2 children, therefore, if they were born after that date, would also then be free. That's a supposition. We don't exactly know what the condition of Isabella is, but that's something that we might assume based on that law, okay? Her 2 children are named as Nathaniel and Betsy, and the enslaver is listed as a Peter King. So again, if we wanted to find more information from this record, we would look under Peter King. We have a really interesting collection of the courts for the trial of enslaved and free blacks. These were actually established in 1726, so before Delaware was even a state. This was when we were still under proprietary rule, and it was a dedicated court for adjudicating cases involving black and mulatto defendants. At the time, it was referred to as the Court for Mulatto and Negro Slaves, or the Special Court for the Trial of Negroes. There's a lot of really fascinating stories within here. I won't go into too much detail, but just reading through some of these depositions is fascinating. This is the story of a woman by the name of Phyllis from 1783. She's a little bit of a hero of mine because she was actually charged for arson, and I figure she got herself into some good trouble. Anyway, here's another example of a manumission. This is a manumission for a man by the name of Benaiah Mifflin from Warner Mifflin. Okay, so Warner Mifflin, the enslaver, was a Quaker who lived just right up the road in Camden. In 1775, 1776, so Revolutionary period, he had a bit of a change of heart. He manumitted the enslaved people that he had living within his estate, many of whom he had inherited from his father. So again, will records, super important to to trace people back. Also, a number of people who he had brought from his wife's dowry. So she brought with her when she moved here, and I believe from Maryland. Warner Mifflin, once he had this kind of change of heart, he became a very prominent abolitionist and actually petitioned the General Assembly several times to end slavery within the state. So this particular manumission is for several people. Hannah, who is described as an ancient Negro woman. Actually, I think I have that here. We have Ezekiel, who is 25 years of age, Benaiah, aged 27. Benaiah, we actually have quite a bit of information about. And after being freed, he took Mifflin's name for a time. And we see here, we have a record of an orphan's court. So, after he passed, he didn't have a will, and his descendants, his heirs, took this to court to divide his property. In the court record, he's named as Benaiah Mifflin. Later, he took the name of Benaiah Williams. Okay? What's fascinating about this type of record is that we not only have the name of his 2 adult children, we have the name of his widow, we also have the name of his daughter's husbands and his grandchildren. So we have a complete picture of 3 generations of Benaiah Mifflin. We also have an extraordinary map of the lands that he owned. So he actually was quite a wealthy man. He owned 2 plots in Camden, one of 3/4 acre and one of 2 acres. And those are pictured here, numbered because they would have then been divided between his heirs. In his orphan's court, his granddaughter, Grace Williams, was also noted, and we find her name in the almshouse. So she was impoverished, and she is listed here as Grace Williams here. And sadly, almshouses were not just for people who were impoverished, they were also for people suffering with sometimes physical and mental ailments. She is listed here as crazy. But these are incredible records, and again, we have an entirely different presentation just about these types of proper records. You see the types of things that people are listed as. She has fits, he's simple, this person is listed as a cripple. It's extraordinary records. This is a rather very unique record, and one of those things that as archivists, when we came across it, we were like, oh, this is important. This is really significant. This is created in 1866, so directly following the ratification of the 13th Amendment. I will note, and I know that many of you are already aware, Delaware being a border state and fighting on the side of the Union, despite the fact that slavery was legal in Delaware during the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation did not liberate the enslaved people in Delaware because Delaware fought on the side of the Union, and the Emancipation Proclamation only liberated enslaved people who were fighting on the side of the Confederacy, the states that were fighting on the side of the Confederacy. So the enslaved people within Delaware were not freed until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. That's something that's important to note. So that did not happen until the end of 1865. This document was created in 1866 and was found in the county tax assessment books. It is actually a list by 100 within Sussex County, so each 100 is enumerated on the top of the page of each slaveholder and the number of enslaved people that they had, and then it's given a monetary amount. Okay, so why was this created? One assumption is, knowing that these enslaved people were now to be liberated, the slaveholders of Sussex County created this list to present as compensation for property lost. And that is one of the reasons that we assume that there are these monetary values given to the enslaved people that they had. So this page 1 lists Gumboro 100, Broadkill, at the time was known as Broad Kiln, Nanticoke 100, Northwest Fork 100, Broad Creek 100. We have page 2, which lists Little Creek 100, Baltimore 100, Dagsboro 100, Indian River 100, and page 3 that lists Lewis and Rehoboth 100 and Georgetown 100. At the bottom of this list, by 100, is a total amount of enslaved people and a total number given. A total monetary number given. Okay, so you see on the top of this page here, James Anderson, do you remember he being the enslaver of the woman that we think was named Ginny? He's listed there. And we're going to go back to page 2. We see here, down at the bottom, within Indian River 100, a man by the name of David Lingo. And this is an interesting story that we'll find with Daniel Lingo. If we look to the next census record, so that's 1870, so this is post-slavery, we find Daniel Lingo, white man, farmer. Within his household, you see there are 4 young black children. So this is post-slavery, and there are 4 black young children. So this 1870 census represents the first time that formerly enslaved people are going to be listed as individual with a full name and an age, okay? So by comparison, the 1860 census would have been a slave schedule and would have just had the person's age and not a full name. So this is the first time that people are going to be named. So this is the first time that we are seeing these 4 children. So the question being, who are they? Why are they here? Why are they within Daniel Lingo's household? Okay, so let's go back to prior to emancipation. We see a tax assessment for Daniel Lingo. Within his household, he's listing these enslaved people. There's a George, there's a woman by the name of Alicius, and there are these 3 children listed as well. So let's go back to the 1860 census. Remember, we're not going to have names, but we're going to have sex and age. We see that there is an enslaved woman and 2 enslaved children. Okay, so we're seeing a pattern. These are likely the same children that were in the household in 1860 that were in the household in 1870. Okay, so how did these children, now free, stay in the household of Daniel Lingo? We find in our records on the 30th of December, 1865, so a month after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, after they were freed, a woman by the name of Alice signed into bond her children to Daniel Lingo, her former enslaver. Okay? This particular record is for Frank, age 9, who would be indentured until age 21. This is for Sarah, also known as Sally, age 5 until she was 18, Lucy, age 4 until 18, and Lewis, age 2 until the age of 21. These match the names that are on the 1870 census. Okay. So we can only speculate what circumstances there were for why Alice chose, if she wasn't coerced, to indenture her children to Daniel Lingo. It's a very clear example of how the path from enslavement to freedom was not clear and easy, and often fraught with contradiction. At the time, again, I mentioned indentures, and particularly apprentice indentures, were very common, and this kind of paternalistic notion of keeping children who they thought otherwise would be impoverished and they were serving as free labor. If we look at that 1870 census, their roles were as servants. Another example of the path from enslavement to freedom and how it was not clear is the case of Handy versus Clark. In 1868, so remember 1865 is the date of emancipation, a suit was brought against Thomas Jefferson Clark, who had kept two women, Rhoda and Maria Handy, enslaved after emancipation. It is said through the deposition, this is actually an article from the newspaper, but it said through the deposition that he kept them from, under strict supervision, out of contact with friends and the community, so that they were unaware that slavery had ended until September of 1868. And upon finding out, they demanded wages for their labor. Clark refused, and they took him to court for 142 weeks of unpaid wages, the time that they had been held after slavery. Clark attempted to, so it was in papers all through the country, Clark attempted to argue that their testimony was inadmissible, his lawyer did, based on this previous law that had said that testimony from free Black people was only admissible under certain circumstances. In other words, if there was not a white person to testify, and that no Black person could testify against a white person. So the lawyers were just attempting to bring up this particular case and say, no, we can't take their word for it, their testimony for it. And this is the law that they were citing. This is the deposition presented by Attorney William Spruance, in which case he said that the plaintiffs were owed the amount of $500 for their labor. And here we see the result of that case. They were indeed awarded. The judge ruled that that previous law was inadmissible as per the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And Rhoda and Maria were each awarded $250 for their labor, which by no means accounts for the many years that they served enslaved, and by no means is reparation, but it is a small victory in that instance for them, and a fascinating case.
There's another case, Louise May Alcott.
Mm-hmm.
Same situation, but she was held in peonage, her family. They did not know about emancipation or anything, and for generations they stayed that way until about 1965. Wow. And it was a lot of families that were like that. And she went to the Supreme Court and they threw it out. Wow. Mm-hmm. And that was because of peonage. They didn't know. And so it was a genealogist that they kind of linked up together, and she couldn't fathom how did this happen. But where it was deep down south, where all you saw was fields, so they didn't know. And actually the movie Alice is about that.
Fascinating. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of our talk today. I'm happy to take any questions, yeah?
What's the name of the court case again?
It is Handy versus Clark. Yeah, and as I say, it got national attention. There are a number of different write-ups about it. People definitely noted this as, kind of a landmark case of, how would this be adjudicated? How would their testimony be ruled? And definitely. Thomas Jefferson Clark was not painted very good light by any means. He was seen as, a villain by the newspapers. So, very interesting story indeed. So I encourage everyone to utilize the records here to identify either personal family histories or to uncover some of these fascinating stories that really paint a picture of Black Delawareans and their contribution to the state. This type of history is so important, and it's so important to preserve, and really, as I said at the beginning, the best sort of agents of doing that history are individuals themselves, and finding your place within that historical record. Thank you so much for joining us on this freezing cold day. Do we have any other questions?
You might have mentioned, I might have missed it. I had a former professor of mine, he always told me to look at it, kind of like prison records. Do they come useful at any point in terms of?
I mean, they definitely very interesting. We do actually, so unfortunately, we don't have an extensive collection of prison records. We do have workhouse records. Workhouse records are currently confidential. But we do have a really interesting collection of what they refer to as police pedigrees from Wilmington. There is a separate presentation that's done just on those. My colleague, Joe Sullivan, that's kind of been one of his pet projects. And it is very, very interesting in looking at the different types of sentencing that were placed against people by race, and the type of, I mean, they're from the 1920s. We just have this like little snapshot, but the types of things that were illegal at the time, the types of behavior that was going on. One of my favorite individuals in there, we affectionately refer to as the chicken rustler. He was arrested no less than like 30 times for stealing chickens. And, so that type of, and also in terms of just looking at, sort of crime and punishment, the types of punishment that people received. He often received lashes for his crimes. So understanding too, like how it was dealt with at the time. Really interesting stuff. So yeah, I would encourage anybody who's interested in that. Unfortunately, as I say, we only have that particular, but those do have mugshots and they do have criminal records and things like that. But that's really the one collection that we have. In cases like that, a lot of those records were maintained and kept in specific municipalities and by specific municipalities and not transferred to the state archives. Yeah. But fingers crossed the workhouse records will become more available. Yeah.
The slavery census was only for 2 years?
For 2 census records, so that spans 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah, so 1850 and 1860.
And the names listed on that census would be the enslaver?
Correct.
Or the enslaved?
The enslaved do not get named. They only are listed by their sex, so male or female, and their age. But it's one of those things that you then would look to supplementary records like tax assessments to try to put names to those tick marks and try to fill that out and give a picture of who those individuals were. But it is a good way to, if you do find something like a tax assessment, verify that yes, these people were also in the household in 1850. Yes, these people were also in the household in 1860. So the example that I gave of the Lingos, tracing those children and knowing that that they were the oldest of the children were born by 1850 and they were in the 1860 census and then in the 1870 census. So you see them through that line there. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, super. Thanks so much. We, of course, are available by appointment for research. You can walk in, that's fine, but if you have specific records that you would like to see, we do encourage emailing us to make an appointment. That way we can have records pulled prior to you coming in. In addition, we do answer questions via email for specific records. If you want copies of specific records that you found through our catalog online, you can request those by email. We'll invoice you for those. And also, if you need specific direction as to what collections to look at, you can ask very specific questions in those. Yeah.
I guess I do have another question.
Yeah.
So with you referenced, your presentation referenced education for blacks, for Negroes. How far, do you have extensive records of that? I'm thinking of those little two-room schoolhouses and so forth.
Freedmen's Bureau is really the gold mine for that. And that is, of course, going to be post-emancipation, but at the same time as segregated schooling. And those records are fascinating because you have the teacher, you have the number of students, you have oftentimes notes from the teachers about how the school is received in the community, which gives a really interesting picture as to how the larger community viewed the education of Black Delawareans. So it's a gold mine of resource. And then those reports were issued yearly, sometimes I think even quarterly. So you see how the schools are evolving and how many students are there and how frequently the students go, and you see a really clear picture of things. So those records are fascinating. We both have those, and also those, of course, because they were federal records, the National Archives also has copies of those as well. Yeah.
Is it?
But you don't necessarily get them unless someone brings them to you. Let's say, do you accept information on the segregated schools and so forth? Just using that as an example.
Well, at the time, those segregated schools were run by the Department of Public Instruction, so they were state records. So yes, we do have records of those schools, and we do have interesting things like insurance assessments of the actual schoolhouse. So we'll have like a very detailed description of how the schoolhouse was built and what it was built from and how big it was, and and that sort of thing. We don't typically have things like lists of students. Like that's not going to be unless we have a ledger that was kept at the time. But we might have a ledger that was kept that said who the teachers were and some of the work that was done on the school. And then of course the educational directories, which we have, which lists the trustees of the school as well as the head teachers, which is useful information there. You had a question.
Just really quick. So is it a waste of time? Is it better to focus by state, like your research by state, or is it better to go to the National Archives?
Depends on the record that you're looking for. So a lot of, everything that I highlighted today is kept at the state level. Something like the Freedmen's Bureau records, as they say, we have those as well as the National Archive. The National Archive has a much bigger budget than we do, so they've actually digitized a lot of those records, and those are searchable. They're also searchable on Ancestry.com. So if you have access to Ancestry.com, that's another reason to come in here as well. We have complete access to all of the records of Ancestry. So Ancestry is a tiered, type of membership. So like you pay a certain amount for records, and then you pay more if you want more records and so forth. But here on site, you can use our computers to access the entirety of Ancestry. So if you want to come in and do that, from the comfort of your own home, you can also access any Delaware records that are on Ancestry by just putting in your zip code. So you can do that through our website. You go to the Ancestry tab, you put in your zip code, and then you have access to everything that we've contributed to Ancestry.com from our own records. So that's one of the agreements that we have. But it would definitely depend on the type of thing that you're looking for. Census records, of course, are federal records. Those are searchable. Again, Ancestry is a great resource for that, or the National Archive. But we also have them here on microfilm. So if that's more comfortable for you, you can come and look at those. Those are fantastic resources. But the things like tax assessments, those are state records. So they're going to be here. The particular court records, those are going to be here. A lot of the manuscript records are going to be here. So never a waste of time.
Now, I know you said the Freeman's Bureau, you have records of that, but do you have records of the entire Freeman's Bureau or just?
Delaware related, yeah, only Delaware related.
Is there a way to get the entire? Or you have
As far as I know, those are available through the National Archive. And then also, I believe most of them have been made available on Ancestry as well. And it's a little bit tricky. On Ancestry, you do have to kind of search, but when you search it up, you will find that they have a lot of things like manumissions, because they also have deed records that are listed. So if you, for example, come across somebody who has, moved across state lines, and you're looking for somebody in Maryland, sometimes you will be able to find some of those Maryland records on Ancestry, rather than having to go to the Maryland Archive. But it's a lovely place. If you need to go to the Maryland Archive, fantastic. They have some fantastic records, and they're really knowledgeable, really helpful.